talking about who remote and deskless workers are, how popular and common are remote and deskless employees, issues and challenges that face remote and deskless employees. We'll dive into some key principles. In addition to that, some best practices. Troy and Steve will dive into 4 different use cases, and then we'll move along to Q&A. With that, I'm going to launch a couple polls before we get started. With the first one, we'd love to know how many of you folks have remote or deskless employees within your organization. We'll give it about 30, 45 seconds, and then we'll move on to the next one. All right. Thank you, everyone. And we will be sent, just as an FYI, we will be sending out the results of the polls to everyone who attended this webinar. All right. So the next poll that I'm launching before we begin is around, do you feel your organization has the right technology and tools to support a remote and deskless workforce? All righty, let's jump into the very last one, and then I'll be handing it over to Steve after this poll. So the last one is, are you concerned with supporting a remote and deskless workforce within your organization? All right. Thank you to everyone for participating. As I just mentioned, we will be sending those out at the with the follow-up email with the recording and slides. And just one last thing, the slides, the PDF for the slides are available now in the handout section. So if you'd like to download those now or at the end of the webinar, feel free to do so. With that, Steve, you may begin.
Hi everybody, hi, it's Steve Bynghall here. Sorry, I was just fiddling around with the mute button. Let me introduce myself first. So my name's Steve Bynghall. I'm a kind of digital workplace consultant, and you might be able to tell by my accent I'm based in London in the UK. And it's a real pleasure to be able to be invited to contribute to this webinar. So thanks to everyone at Acumenar. So today we're going to talk about remote and deskless employees and how you can manage some of the challenges around that, sort of communicating and working with this sort of important set of employees through a digital workplace. And before we start, I think it's important to kind of try and define what we mean by remote or deskless workers. So deskless workers are essentially employees who do not have access to a desk and therefore a computer terminal during the day, or have limited access. So there are obviously going to be some industry sectors where there are going to be far more deskless workers. So for example, factories and plants, there are many industries where actually, like manufacturing, where, for example, that might be the majority of employees, and that can vary greatly. So there could be people working with highly complex machinery, robotics, but there can also be people who are, for example, doing handcrafting clothes or textiles, for example, in something kind of less high tech. Another big sector is retail and leisure. So I recently attended a different webinar when they had someone on from Walmart who's talking about Walmart having 1.5 million employees in the US alone. That's nearly 1% of the US working population. So there's a huge amount of people who work in retail, and also in leisure, for example, in hotels and in restaurants. You then have a whole group who work in, for example, utilities and engineering. These are the people on who make sure our water supply is there, who fix the kind of lines, the telephone lines and the cables, etc. So another big group. And then there's also travel and logistics. So these can vary from people who cabin crews on an airline to long distance lorry drivers, truck drivers, etc. And another example, healthcare, employees who work in hospitals or out in sort of community care. But then there are many others. Teachers do not generally work at a desk, policemen, people in the emergency services, people in the military. So there is an awful lot of deskless workers. Remote workers, some of these employees do work remotely. They're working effectively out in the field, but also there are employees who are based in offices who also, or partly based in offices who also work remotely, perhaps from home. Sometimes it's called telecommuting, although that term is now tending to be used kind of less and less. Mike, do you want to go to the next slide, please? So talked a lot about deskless employees, but I think remote work is something that's becoming more and more common as well, and most of us will have experienced that ourselves. So there was a recent article from CNBC that said at least 70% of people actually work globally, or this around the world. 70% of people work remotely at least once a week, and I think I often find people they might be working from home. This is in an office, or they might be working from a different location. Perhaps they're out at a client. So remote working is not it's not something that's particularly obscure. It's very, very common, and you do actually find in the digital workplace world, it's surprising how many actual sort of things like intranet managers and sort of HR people and people in employee communications do actually work remotely themselves. And I don't know what your experience is, but my experience of working remotely is I get a lot more done. So this is a study by Forbes that suggests 65% of full-time employees think a remote work schedule will increase their productivity. And the same report kind of echoes the same opinion from managers. And that increases down to two kind of things. One is people just gain a couple of hours back because they don't have to commute into an office. Second thing they do is they avoid the distractions. So I don't know, if you're if you're going into an office and you get distracted by people coming up to your desk, by you getting into a kind of conversation with someone, etc. So you can be far more focused, I find, if you are working from home or working remotely. And some people kind of go and do their work if they have a kind of report to write or something that needs quiet, and they will go and try and work sometimes from home. So Mike, do you want to the next slide, please? And it's also this idea that remote work is becoming more common is not, it really is. So this was a report, I think it was mentioned by CNBC. The percent of American employees working remotely has increased by 10% in, from 2012 to 2016. So in 2019, that's going to be even higher, and it reflects, other workplace trends like the growth of the gig economy, things like that. So we are seeing more remote working, and that's obviously partly because it's enabled by better technology, better digital workplaces. Mike, do you want to give me? And also we've talked about the deskless workers as well. The report from VentureBeat suggests there's 2.7 billion people who are categorized as deskless. That's an awful lot of people. So we're not talking about an obscure demographic here. We're talking about a core part of the workforce. So Mike, do you want to, next slide, please? So when we're looking at remote and deskless employees, we do tend to find there are some kind of issues, and I've seen this it's kind of true of smaller organizations, of sort of larger organizations. What we often find, this is particularly true of I kind of guess deskless employees, is they're just not fully connected to the intranet or digital workplace. So I'm working currently with an organization that's primarily manufacturing, but it also has some retail units, and the majority of their employees do not have access to kind of digital services or digital content. Communications, for example, is all delivered face-to-face or even through kind of like hard copy newsletters or notice boards. And in a kind of modern digital workplace and with modern communication tools, I think this leaves these groups digitally disadvantaged, because they don't have full access to the services and the content that sometimes their equivalent has in the who work in an office. And I don't think that's right. I think particularly when you're trying to provide a good employee experience and drive engagement and drive happier employees, and giving messages of of inclusivity and diversity and inclusion, to then have some groups kind of disadvantaged because they're not connected, then that's not such a good thing. And obviously they miss out on opportunities, or organizations miss out on opportunities to engage those kind of staff, which can help, for example, reduce employee turnover. Another element that organizations miss out is sometimes is sort of leveraging the insights of those people working on the front line, because their insights are particularly kind of valuable. So, for example, if you take a retail organization, often a retail organization will want to improve improve customer service rather, but that's very difficult. The people, or they'll ask people to kind of give input on how, or ideas on how they can improve customer service, and the employees who have the best idea are those ones who work directly with customers. These are the people who are going to kind of get the insights. So if they are excluded for those kind of giving ideas, for example, because they don't have access to a digital platform, then organizations are missing out. And finally, also when employees don't have access to digital services, it tends to, some of the processes they need to do tend to have to rely on kind of less efficient means. So, for example, this can mean if you wanted to book annual leave, for example, you may have to complete a kind of paper form, and that still happens, and it's obviously then organizations are missing out on opportunities to improve processes and increase productivity. Next slide, please. So let's look at some of the more specific kind of challenges that are associated with deskless and remote workers. And fundamentally, a lot of these problems are because employees, as I said at the beginning, employees don't have access to a terminal during the day, so they're kind of hard to reach. But sometimes there's an extra layer of complexity because they also don't have a corporate device, and they may not even have a digital identity, so they're hard to connect. So it's quite rare, for example, for all the employees in a factory to have Office 365 licenses, and I can fully understand that there might not necessarily be a need for them to have that. But how do you then communicate with those employees if they don't have a kind of corporate device, or they don't even have a digital identity? And the best way to normally reach them, and what most organizations choose to do, is to, if they are going to give access to a kind of digital workplace or to an intranet, is to allow employees to use their own devices. I think that is the best option, but there can be also challenges there, for example, with security around data, challenges around GDPR. Not every employee wants to use their own device, so there are some logistical hurdles there as well. I also have found that sometimes there is a mindset, I've seen it in some kind of internal communications functions, even in some HR functions, that somehow these employees are less important to kind of communicate with. And it might be they have kind of different needs, but often I find it's because people who work in support departments have less understanding of what frontline employees do on a daily basis, because they're that much further sort of removed from them. So I think it is a kind of mindset thing, and I think it's changing, because as it gets easier and easier to connect kind of frontline employees, deskless employees, I think that's something that's sort of being overcome. There's also a kind of associated problem with remote workers. So if an employee is working from home, there is still a kind of, in some places, and you find this occasionally, pockets of kind of more traditional views there, where people think, okay, this person isn't really working fully, they're not fully at work, even though they're working from home. And again, I think they're then not seen as being kind of a key part of the workforce. Another logistical problem is that in some sectors, actually the remote and deskless workers tend to be quite fluid. So for example, retail and leisure has particularly high turnover, like younger people tending to work in restaurants has quite a high turnover, so that's presents some logistical challenges. And there's also sometimes some sectors where there's a lot of contractors. For example, in healthcare, they may not be able to access all these services that full-time employees can do. We're just going to cover a couple more challenges in the next slide. So Mike, can we have the next slide, please? So sometimes, particularly in factories, in some countries, there tend to be more kind of trade unions or workers' councils who need to be kind of consulted when you change the way these employees are kind of communicated with. That's not necessarily a problem, but it can be more complex. And again, this is a very specific issue. So which I found when I was helping roll out Workplace by Facebook in a retail, in a hotel group. There was a kind of real lack of clarity about when can I access the digital workplace using my mobile phone, because on one hand there was a rule saying never use your personal mobile device in front of a customer, and on the other hand you're saying, well, access all these work this work information using your personal mobile device. So sometimes there are these anomalies which need to be kind of clarified. So those are some of the challenges. So Mike, can we have the next slide, please? So how do you kind of tackle some of these sort of issues? So I think one of the important things is to start from some kind of principles. So my first thing, and I feel quite strongly about this, is everybody should have access to the digital workplace. So regardless of whether they work in an office, or whether they work sweeping a road, or if they work in a restaurant cleaning up all the dishes, they should, if they are an employee of yours, they should have access at least to the digital workplace, or some means of accessing it. So that's kind of in principle. And the way that kind of translates is often, realistically, organizations aren't necessarily going to suddenly create digital identities for everyone. So, and people are going to need to access the digital workplace and digital services and content in different ways. So for me, this is trying to eliminate any disadvantages that people have in accessing content and information, rather than necessarily creating a blanket the same access for everybody, because that's not realistic and that's not actually what everyone wants. Doing that in a particularly where you have a deskless or high instance of deskless employees is to use mobile solutions. It has to be, your solution has to be mobile, and it should be mobile anyway, because office workers will find that useful too. And then you need to make sure you're kind of tailoring the experience to the needs of deskless employees, just in the same way you would to any other kind of demographic or group, and that also includes remote workers too, people who are working from home or people who are out on the road. And tailor experiencing can mean making sure you optimize the experience for mobile devices, making sure that there are use cases which cover their particular needs, and also taking into account the kind of scenarios that those users might encounter when they're out in the field. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Can I have the next slide, please? So let's sort of move on to some of the best practices. So the first thing is, if you have a kind of digital workplace and an intranet, as I said, you want to make sure that your solution is available on a mobile device, and that could be corporate owned, that could be employee owned. It could be an iPad, it could be Android or iOS. So I think that's kind of a given, and it should be tailored to optimized, either through an app or through making through responsive design, adaptive design, etc. Then also, where you have problems with digital identity, so where employees don't have emails, there are kind of different options to be able to identify staff and validate devices. So I'm kind of not an expert on the ways that are done, but I've seen various companies do different approaches. So for example, people have created IDs from payroll numbers, for example. I know one company created email addresses from staff numbers. There's also options to use personal email addresses that can have some issues around GDPR. It can make people sound uncomfortable, but not all the time. I've also seen an example where from the payroll, people have they've printed out a sheet for an employee to, and with a QR code for a employee to put their own mobile device on, then use SMS to validate that it's them and their device. So there are options, and different providers have realized this is a sort of issue. And then there are also products and apps that can make sure it works within your mobile device management solution, so you're navigating all the security issues that might be important for your organization. One thing that sometimes gets forgotten about is making provision for Wi-Fi, so employees can connect without having to eat up their personal data. So this is something I've seen a couple of times where particularly this can happen if deskless workers are working in your on premises, like in a retail outlet, for example, and you're asking them to use their own personal mobile phone, and then they're having to eat into their own data. That's not good. So people want to make sure that there's Wi-Fi, so personal data is not being used. And if personal devices are being used, for example, out in the field, then some employees or some employers can provide some financial support to cover those costs. And then I think providing clarity of use on how mobile devices should be used, for example, in front of customers. When there's ambiguity, people tend to avoid using a device because they're not quite sure, they don't want to get in trouble. So if it's clear and in black and white, then people can feel safe in using their device to access an internet or the digital workplace. Mike, can we have the next slide, please? So just a few more best practices before I dip into a couple of examples. So one thing that I think is really important is there are always going to be some, particularly if you're asking a remote worker or someone who doesn't have a desk, if you're asking them to use their own personal devices, they may not want to. So you need to still offer them an option to be able to access services without having to go through that route. So sometimes a kiosk or a shared terminal on your premises can be very useful. So I know one train company, they used to have a kind of pool iPad which people could access all the services if they wanted to. They just kept in like the sort of breakout areas for employees. Also, when you think about use, it's also really important to make sure you think about any kind of requirements that people have, based on the scenarios they are. So for example, if people work in areas of no or low connectivity, and they're inputting work, can they, for example, save things offline? Things like that. I remember reading a while ago about food inspectors who used to, I think it was in somewhere in America, where they used to have to, they filed their reports on an iPad, but often they were in refrigerated areas in restaurants or in food outlets, and when they were in there, their iPads all went a bit strange. So no one had sort of thought of that sort of use case. There are some use cases that are also going to make real sense for mobile employees. So like retail staff who are able to swap roster information, for example, saying I'm on this shift, can I swap with you? That's quite common. But also a use case for remote workers is being able to particularly to be able to collaborate and work closely with their team, and perhaps can be quite lonely working from home, so getting a sense of like a kind of social feed, so you can kind of communicate and chat to employees, so it just feels like you're more connected to your team. Lots of other fairly obvious ones. So if you're delivering services to a mobile device, if you make the messaging kind of short, no one really wants to scroll through masses and masses and masses of text. It might look great on desktop, but it's perhaps not so good on a smartphone. And echoing what I said before about trade unions and work councils, if you work early, if you're introducing a kind of digital solution or an app, if you're working early with those groups, then you can, it helps to sort of remove any barriers. And you can also find, you might find that working with some of those groups who often have who are quite influential, for example, in a factory, that can be kind of work out as a fruitful sort of partnership. And as I said before, when you give everyone a voice and leverage insights and feedback from kind of everyone and have frontline staff and remote employees, it helps create that level playing field. It helps, it's kind of following through with some of perhaps the kind of statements your CEO may have made about employee experience, or trying to make value everyone as an employee. So it's kind of a reflection of I think where you need to be. Can we have the next kind of slide, Mike, please? So another kind of best practice is to consider having some kind of digital workplace solution. And by this I mean that kind of like one place where employees can access some of the key systems they need they'll need during the working day. So if you can access some of the information you need, or some of the critical things you need from Salesforce or from Workday, for your sales information, or for HR information from SAP, or you want to use ServiceNow to request an IT ticket, etc. If you are a remote worker, and if you're a deskless worker, it's virtually impossible asking people to go into 7 or 8 different systems to get all the things they need to do. It just makes their life kind of miserable, and particularly from a mobile device, it's very, very difficult, because you might actually either have to have 6 or 7 different apps downloaded, or sometimes the digital workplace experience that some of these systems have is not optimal. If you have one solution, it can make things so much easier, particularly for remote and deskless employees. And the ideal thing is where you have a solution where it's very easy to integrate anything with an API into that, where it can kind of surface data and employees can carry out sort of simple transactions. And you also need to make sure this is truly scalable. As we saw, for example, how remote working patterns are changing pretty rapidly. If you and often, when sometimes offices close or people want to reduce office space, they kind of are creating more remote jobs, for example. A solution needs to be kind of scalable, so you can ramp that up or down as needs be, and obviously that reflects the rapid changes that can happen for organizations, for example, when they acquire new offices, or they split into 2, or they restructure, etc. So I'm just going to dip into a couple of quick examples. I realize I probably need to speed up a little bit here. So Heathrow Airport, this is not something, this is an example I often return to. It's not something I was involved in. I wish I was, because it's a really excellent example. Heathrow Airport is London's biggest airport. It's one of the biggest airports in the world, and actually 2/3 of its employees don't work at desks. They're involved in operations, etc., all over the place, lots of different kind of roles. And one thing was kind of clear. They did some employee engagement surveys and found that those workers who weren't at desks had significantly lower levels of employee engagement than their colleagues in offices. So, and they put this down partly because they had sort of poor access to kind of digital services. So on the back of a kind of digital transformation program, they really focused on the needs of those deskless and remote workers. And they one of the things they did was they did a lot of user research, and found that a mobile intranet that could be used on personal devices was something that people desired. But also, I think what's interesting, they made sure it included kind of features that resonated with those different groups. So while management, I think, assumed that everyone would want to read like news and kind of strategic information, and I'm not saying that's not important, actually what most employees wanted was operational information, for example, about the weather and passenger information and problems coming up in real time. They also wanted to know about the benefits they received, because, you know, if you're working in an airport, there's lots of retail outlets you can get discounts at. So these were the kind of things they want. And one thing they did was they made sure Wi-Fi was enabled everywhere throughout the airport. So when you were at work, you know, you weren't being charged with basically for accessing systems that you needed for your work. And they did some nice touches. So they made sure, for example, that you only had to log in once, and then you could stay authenticated into the Wi-Fi for about a year. Right, and then quickly, the final example I'm going to mention, Mike can have the next slide, is Stagecoach. So this is a UK bus company, and they've got about 18,000 bus drivers and engineers throughout the UK, and they really had little or no access to an existing intranet and digital services. So they would use kind of manual forms. They had to rely on managers in the bus depot for operational information. They had to look on, notice boards, etc. So it was very inefficient. So what Stagecoach did was they gave them a mobile app that gave them operational information, and digital forms has also started to aggregate some of the other kind of services just into one place, and this has been really successful. They've got kind of spectacular levels of adoption, and it's had some really interesting impacts. So because drivers and engineers now don't need to go and, for example, ask their supervisor, you know, what are there any issues I need to know. They can just do it when they're sitting in the cab of their bus, looking at the operational information. And actually, they had a reduction in the buses that were leaving the depot late, because nobody had to queue up to ask like this one person any information anymore. And they're starting to use kind of digital forms that kind of report near misses, for example. So key operational information that can help drive safety, for example. And what's even more important, I think, is they have this kind of chat facility where they kind of swap. Drivers will tell other drivers if there's an issue with the route. There's kind of better communication between the back office and the frontline staff. There's a lot of kind of banter and sort of engagement. And actually, employees are really happy using this kind of tool. And I'm involved in a global intranet awards called the Step 2 Awards, and this was one of our winners. And it was very good. But it's a great example of how you can, you know, if you do a proper digital workplace, you can really engage employees and drive kind of efficiencies and remove that digital divide between office workers and those who don't work in the office. And that's all I really wanted to say. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Steve. So with that, we're going to transition to Troy's presentation to dive through some case studies. Troy, you may begin.
Great, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Mike. And I've just got a couple that I wanted to share really quickly from work that we've done with some of our customers. You know, and much like some of the use cases that Steve was talking about, it really is about enabling, you know, those workers that don't have a traditional desk that they sit at. You know, specifically when we look at the Boston Red Sox, and they're one of many sporting teams that use our software and work with us. they had some core challenges around general communication to all of their employees, but specifically their day of game or day of event staff, which when you look at it, their organization numbers in the hundreds of employees on days where they don't have events. But that blows up to over 3,000 employees anytime they have an event at Fenway Park, whether it's one of their 80 some odd baseball games they have a year, or any of the other sporting events and concerts that they run. And these workers didn't have access to even core information around what was happening that day on their devices. Even in terms of if there's a rain delay or a rain out during a game, they wouldn't often know until they got to the park or thought to call somebody before they headed out to the park to work that day. And so what the Red Sox did with their software is they gave them all access to their internal portal via their mobile devices. And that solved a core challenge around this basic communication, but they're also able to go in and then start building things like mobile apps for chatbots and things like that allow those employees to give better customer service to the folks in the stands. And so it really enabled them to be much more agile with how they communicated to their employees, but then ultimately how those employees could then better serve their fans and their customers. And so that's a great story of kind of taking an organization that wasn't mobile enabled for those deskless or field workers and really connecting them into the organization and into the information they needed to get their jobs done. When you take a look at the next case here, Sleep Number, they have this core challenge around their kind of core employees that work with their customers. They, again, other than the registers and the machines that they, might ring up the transactions in, they don't have, laptops or desktops that they sit at. They're out in the stores working. But what they were able to do was give them tablets that had a mobile app enabled on it that gave those employees access to information that was critical to their job. So, Steve would mention things like, news and information is important. But if you think about somebody working in a store, if I go into a store as a customer, I want that employee to be knowledgeable, right? That's why I'm going in there, because I'm looking for information about a product or I want to buy a product. And what Sleep Number was able to do using our software is they were able to build this mobile interface that gave those store employees access to promotional information, to product info, to all the things that they needed to have at their fingertips to really be able to go in and serve that customer at that point of transaction or that point of inquiry when they were really looking for information about the products that Sleep Number sold. So again, these organizations certainly have that traditional digital workplace or intranet that they utilize for their, if you want to think of them as knowledge workers or corporate employees. But these two use cases are very specifically around how do we engage those deskless or remote workers, people that aren't traditionally inside your corporate walls, if you want to think of it that way, and don't have a desktop or laptop that they're given as part of their job, but need to have access to critical information to be able to work effectively and in a lot of cases, serve the customers of their organizations more effectively. So those are the things I wanted to share. Certainly happy to participate in the Q&A that we've got set up and answer any questions you folks might have as well.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you, Steve. So before we jump into Q&A, we have one last poll question for you folks still on the line. We'd love to know if any of you, are interested in learning more about how you can partner with Acumatica to help you with your remote deskless workers within your organization. Any of you who are interested, feel free to let us know. We're happy to send some additional materials and follow up. We'll give that about 30 seconds, and then we'll jump into Q&A. All right. Thank you, everyone. So let's jump into it. Steve, the first question is from you, and it's from Alex in the audience. He wants to know, what would you say is the biggest challenge or the most common challenge for organizations in terms of supporting their remote workers?
Remote workers. I think it's about mindset. So it's about the mindset often of how other employees regard remote employees. So I'm thinking more, when we're talking about remote employees, I'm thinking more like, for example, in an office where people perhaps work remotely, perhaps they come into the office occasionally, but they are essentially home working or working from a different location. And you know, changing that mindset can be hard. So you do often find like pockets of kind of resistance, I guess. So you need where those employees aren't regarded as kind of being fully at work. So there's still this kind of stigma of working from home is not somehow sort of proper work. And I think that can be a challenge. It's certainly a challenge for the individual employees who work from home, and they can be sort of feel a bit remote and left out from the social side, for example, or the kind of information that gets spread, or the unofficial information that gets spread about about what's happening when they're sort of removed from the office. I think sometimes when we're talking perhaps in terms of remote workers, like field workers, for example, that can also be sometimes I think it's less of a mindset, more pragmatics in terms of employees. If they're sort of removed from, or they don't have to come back to headquarters, for example, they can feel, I don't know, they just don't feel very, very connected. And I think that there can be sort of issues with engagement there. I remember one example, I think from the awards, where we looked at there was a company who were they were a water provider, though they were utilities, but they had a lot of remote teams. This was in Scotland, who kind of worked almost kind of on their own, and who tended to be sort of quite lonely, and they kind of did their own thing. And so actually, when they started connecting people, apart from some logistics with remote, being out in sort of very remote locations and some connectivity issues, once they actually were working, people found out that the engagement that shot up was quite striking, because for the first time they were kind of connected back into the office. So that can result in, I suppose, some challenges around the sort of kind of change, or changes in ways of working too. So it's a lot about, I sort of thinking out loud, I guess it's a lot about mindset and a lot about change, less so the kind of logistics and the technology, because that's there, I guess.
All right, thank you, Steve. The next one is for Troy. Joe in the audience wants to know, how can Acumatica support remote and deskless workers, or rather, how does it support them?
Sure, that's a great. Our platform, and not to get too deep into it just because of time, but our platform provides the ability for creating either experiences that are available across all devices. So think in terms of a digital workplace that can be accessed not just on a desktop or a laptop, but on a mobile device through either a mobile web browser or a native mobile app. So giving those people that aren't sitting at a desk all day long, like myself, I travel a lot, access to information that I need right at my fingertips on my mobile. The other way that we can help is we don't just look at providing a modern intranet as a solution to these digital workplace challenges. If you think of the Sleep Number example, they're providing a bespoke interface for those store workers. It's not the corporate intranet that they're going to in the stores. They have a mobile app on those tablets that gives them very specific experiences around what they need while they're in the store and while they're working, to get them information that's critical to their task. So we can create these experiences that are very persona-driven based on what a certain employee type needs to have. And that's very critical when you look at things like travel and leisure workers, retail workers, people on even factory and manufacturing floors, where you really need to get them very specific experiences and information. Sure, they might need to get to benefits and news and other things like that as an employee, but as they're doing their job and in their work, they need to be able to get to certain information very, very quickly. And that's where the flexibility of the platform that we've built comes in, because I can build those experiences for those workers when I need to.
Thank you, Troy. So we have another question that maybe, Steve, you could start, and Troy, you can chime in as well. One issue is, so this is from Tom in the audience. He said, one issue is working off the clock. What solutions have you seen around either getting data from scheduling systems and populate within a digital workplace solution like this to limit what activities employees can or can't do during the hours they're supposed to be working if they're, I'm guessing he's referencing if they're hourly employees. Steve, do you want to start that one?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think in terms of restricting kind of access. Well, I think that's more of a kind of US sort of issue rather than in Europe in terms of trying to restricting access. I mean, I know one thing I have seen is, for example, for office workers when they're working outside, some companies have introduced kind of email policies, for example, which will say, people aren't expected to answer particular emails, and then also, even then stop them being kind of sent. I'm not aware of more of any kind of specific approaches that have been made to sort of turn access to different systems or particular information sort of on and off. I think it's very very complex, and also the sort of flexibility that generally people want, certainly sort of in Europe, is generally those approaches haven't been executed in most of the examples that I've seen, but it may be different. But Troy, you may have a kind of different take on it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, from a technology perspective, you do have the ability to, as long as the system that controls kind of my schedule, say I'm an hourly worker, as long as that system gives us the ability to detect when somebody is on or off the clock. And again, we don't have time to get too deep into the platform today, but certainly can follow up. As long as that system, say it's Chronos, and it can alert me that Mike is logged in or is trying to log in and he's off the clock, I can restrict him from seeing certain work data if we want to. So maybe he doesn't get to see certain policy information or procedural information that he shouldn't be seeing when he's off the clock, but he could see a shift schedule, or he could see job openings that he might want to bid on, and things like that. So we've certainly seen some cases like that where we've worked with customers, but again, it's more about does the technology that's controlling that worker shift, does it make that type of information available to us as a software platform? If it does, then we can use those techniques. We've seen a few customers do that, but it's really kind of been more open in terms of the Red Sox, for example. They don't restrict their employees from getting at their data whenever they want. They want the opposite. They want them to have constant access. So it's more about, does the technology allow it, and then is that organization either obligated to keep track of that, or do they want to restrict those things?
And so we're running out of time. Let me throw out one last question to each of you. So I'll start with you, Troy, since you just mentioned the Red Sox. Daisy in the audience. She wants to know, who actually is managing the system and delivering content to employees at the Red Sox? What does sort of the administrative situation within the system look like there?
Sure. So it depends on the different types of content that you're talking about specifically for them. Their kind of day of event or day of game information, that's collated by a number of different departments, as you can imagine, and they've got an administrator that then takes that information and publishes it into the web interface. It actually used to be just a Word document that they would email around before they implemented the solution. Now they make that information available online on the portal, but because it touches all of the different types of job functions at the SOX, there's a lot of people. The grounds crews have to give information. The people handling the VIPs have to give information. The people coordinating who are going to be throwing out the first pitch have to give information, and it's collated by a central person to go in and then give that information to everybody through the portal. Now, for news and events and things like that, they certainly have comms people that manage those things. And then when you start talking about information like HR policies and procedures, those are certainly handled by those departments. And that's one of the benefits of our software, is it makes it easy for people who are not technologists to go in and post information directly. You can certainly use workflows and approvals and things like that to make sure that you've got governance over publishing, but really it's about giving people access to publish those things directly without them having to be an IT resource.
Thank you, Troy. So with that, actually looking at the clock, we're running out of time. So, I apologize to you, Cynthia, you, John, who had a couple questions, and Mark. We'll try and follow up via email. With that said, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank our two speakers, Steve and Troy, for doing a wonderful presentation. As previously mentioned, the recording will be available within 24 hours. We'll email it out to everyone who registered along with the slides. We will be hosting a Kumina remote worker demo webinar to show you how you can set up these instances within our platform later this month. We'll be sending it out to all registrants as well if you're interested in attending that. With that, again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. Look forward to seeing you the next time. Bye.